General quarters. All hands man your battle stations.
Welcome to WETSU, a Battleship New Jersey podcast. I'm your host, Marshal Spevak, and I have the distinct honor of serving as the CEO of the Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. This podcast is our way of bringing you closer to the stories, history, and people who have shaped the legacy of our nation's most decorated battleship. Today, we're honored to have joining us Dr. Christopher Lehman Sr. His story is one of service, leadership, and a lifelong dedication to our Navy and military history. Chris is a Philly kid through and through. He's an alumni of St. Joe's University, and his family roots date back to the founding of the city of Philadelphia. After serving in the U.S. Navy Reserve from 1969 to 1971, he embarked on an impressive career at the highest levels of government, shaping defense and security policy in the United States Senate, the State Department, and the White House. From 1976 to 1981, Chris was a key figure on the Senate Armed Services Committee, advising Chairman Harry Byrd Jr. and Chairman John Warner, both from the Commonwealth of Virginia. Chris also served as Chairman Warner's Special Assistant for National Security Affairs, where he was a senior advisor on arms control, naval force posture, among other topics. He then served as the director of the Office of Strategic Nuclear Policy at the State Department, before being appointed as Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and Senior Director for Legislative and Legal Affairs on the National Security Council, where he played a pivotal role in shaping U.S. defense strategy during the Cold War and during the Reagan administration. After decades of service in both the public and private sectors, Chris now serves as chairman of the board of the Landing Craft Support Museum Foundation, which is dedicated to preserving the legacy of Navy veterans who served in the Pacific during World War II. Many Battleship New Jersey fans will recognize the Lehman name. His brother John served as President Reagan's Secretary of the Navy, spearheading the 600-ship Navy initiative and playing a crucial role in the battleship's 1982 reactivation. And as we'll discuss, Chris himself was deeply involved in that effort, making his connection to this ship all that more significant. Chris, welcome back aboard the Battleship New Jersey. It's an honor to have you on the podcast.
An honor to be aboard such a historic and decorated ship, and always good to be on steel on the water.
I just want to start from the beginning. Your father, John Sr., was a captain of an amphibious ship in World War II and was decorated for his role during the Marine landing in Okinawa. A December 1985 New York Times Magazine article said, around the Lehman household, the children were summoned to chow, and you were told to ship up or ship out. Now, typically, the first question I ask of anybody in this podcast is, why did you join the Navy? But I think maybe I'll amend that for you and ask you, was joining the Navy ever not an option for you?
Subliminally, I think the answer is that it was never not an option. But in terms of intellectual, you're young and you don't really think about that very much. But as I got older, I was very fortunate. My dad, after the war, stayed in the reserves and actually did duty at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard.
Okay.
As his reserve assignment. But also, Naval Air Station Willow Grove was, maybe 5 air miles from my home. So when we were growing up, there were airplanes in the sky virtually all the time. But more importantly, the family ritual required watching Victory at Sea. The years it was on totally shaped my innards. So that love in the Navy was big. And then I actually wanted to fly.
Okay.
And joined the Navy to fly, and my eyes wound up going below minimum, so I never got my wings. So that was a great frustration, but I stayed as an airman, forget my exact rank, probably E3. But loved the Navy, and then, of course, having a dad who served in the Pacific, that influenced things as well. But the Navy, I spent most of my educational career in college and beyond focusing on American defense and foreign policy, and it was so clear that from even before the formal founding of the United States, we had a Navy, and we still have a Navy. And the Constitution, of course, makes it very clear you raise armies when you need them, you maintain a Navy. And I think most Americans don't really realize that. Our founding fathers understood you need the Navy anytime, all the time, and you need it to be ready and shaping the battle space of the oceans. So I'm a Navy advocate ×5.
But you did spend some time in the Navy, in the Reserve. How did you spend your 2 years? Any time at sea?
The short answer is no. I was always in training, and I was in the individual ready reserve where I was still in college, and they could have called me up if they needed me. Fortunately, they only needed me in the summers.
Got it.
But I've been on ships, and but my duty was not on ships. And of course, the beauty is after I left the Naval Reserve my job was the military, so all the services. So I had the privilege of being on ships at sea, landing on carriers. Because I did the strategic nuclear policy, I actually had the privilege of going out on a missile submarine and participating in a training launch of a Poseidon missiles.
That's great.
And I've probably been on 10 or 15 carriers at sea and destroyers and submarines. So, but I was always either a VIP or a congressional person sniffing around. My seat time was pretty short.
1976, you started working in the United States Senate, first for Senator Harry Byrd Jr., who was at the time the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and then for John Warner, himself, former Secretary of the Navy. We've interviewed a member of Congress, but we've yet to interview somebody who was in a senior staff position like you were. Can you tell us what it was like at the time working in the Senate, and what was it like working for larger than life figures like Harry Byrd, like John Warner?
Well, it was long hours, low pay, and all the fun I could stand in a very real sense. And I guess I would say that the privilege of being in the middle of the 76 election, where it was Carter versus Ford, and of course Carter won. And in the next 4 years, he actually campaigned on cutting defense by 50%. And started working on that. And of course, the Senate Armed Services Committee was a deep believer in military power in general and naval power in particular. And believe it or not, I don't know the actual ratio, but I'd say more than half of the members of the Senate who were on the Armed Services Committee had served in the military at one point in their life. They had people with experience and knowledge, and in many cases, knowledge of war, because Senator Byrd was a naval officer during World War II. Senator Warner was an enlisted man in World War II, and then an officer in the Korean War. So lots of depth of experience that it was just expertise. So you were in the game and in the fight. And the Armed Services Committee was fighting Carter, who was trying to cut defense. So it was a political environment, but it was a policy environment and national policy in terms of national defense. So it was a very heady time. And then we did the Panama Canal Treaty a year or two later. The Senate Armed Services Committee was fighting President Carter's move to actually shrink the Navy. Not just the Navy, but the Army, Air Force, and Marines. The good news is that the Senate would modify the president's proposed defense budget and increase funding. And they particularly increased funding for ships, because we had ships that couldn't sail and planes that couldn't fly, and the readiness was down. The Vietnam hangover was pretty heavy upon the nation. And it was a very epical time in terms of turning things around. In the 4 years of President Carter, he actually vetoed an aircraft carrier. He vetoed the defense appropriation bill for, I think, fiscal 79,
Right.
saying we don't need it. And there weren't enough votes to override the president veto, so that veto stuck, and an aircraft carrier was struck. The good news is that the next year, the Senate Armed Services Committee put the carrier back in the next year's budget. Somehow we persuaded the president that if he vetoed it again, he would be overridden. And that's a little piece of history that you don't see hardly anywhere,
Sure.
but it's a fact and it's provable.
You worked at the Senate Armed Services Committee, another pivotal time for us here, the debate about reactivation of Iowa-class battleships. Can you talk to us a little bit about your involvement in that on Senate Armed Services, and give us a little bit of behind-the-scenes insight into that debate?
Well, there were multiple senators that were navalists at heart and through experience, and there was a staff mafia of people who believed in the Navy and the Air Force and the Army and the Marines, but a bunch of us were either in the Navy or just naval in our orientation of the importance to the nation. And so the pressure was on to bring the battleships back, because naval gunfire support was decisive in World War II and in Korea, and our capability in that realm was disappearing. And of course, I think it was this ship that was reactivated for Vietnam, if my memory serves me.
Yep, we're the only Iowa reactivated. Yeah.
And then, of course, after 2 years or so, it was put back in mothballs. And so there was a move to bring it back, because certainly in a region like the Pacific, naval gunfire is key, particularly in an archipelago island kind of an environment. So there was a move to bring it back. And one of my great disappointments is two Republican senators who were generally pro-defense were viscerally and violently in opposition to bringing it back. Not battleships, all four of them. One was Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, and the other was Ted Stevens, who was on the Appropriations Committee and was the Republican senator from Alaska. And I'll never forget, you'll appreciate this. I'm sitting on the floor supporting Senator John Tower, who was a navalist and a real advocate, and he gave a stirring defense of the wisdom of bringing the battleships back. Senator Stevens got up and he was energized and he was just banging the table and making the argument that it's a dinosaur and we don't need it and it's old technology. And there were easy rebuttals to it, of course. So he's ranting on the floor and the senator and I are sitting there. And I leaned over to the senator and I said, isn't it great? We got truth, justice, and the American way on our side in this argument, and trying to decide if I can quote the expletive or not. But it was kind of, you know what? You don't need truth. You don't need justice. You don't need shit. You need 51 votes.
That's right.
And I came up with the aphorism, I guess might be the word, of Towers' rule of 51. And I can't tell you how many times that's been helpful to me over the years of my career, State Department on nuclear weapons issues and arms control, and in the White House in terms of defense issues, even in terms of Grenada and other issues of the day. You don't need truth and justice. You need 51 votes.
That's right.
And the beauty is we had 51 votes and we brought the battleships back. And I think it was a mistake to put them away, actually. But, after Reagan's time, the peace dividend issue became pretty large in terms of, the Soviet Union is gone.
Right.
We don't need all this military power. Well, the fact is, if you look at history, you do this up and down,
absolutely.
up and down.
We've been talking a lot on the Battleship recently about the reactivation at this time, and there was a New York Times Magazine article which shed a lot of light on some of these things and sort of told the story about Chuck Meyers and how he sort of laid the groundwork for the reactivation of the battleships, of the Iowa class battleships, with Congress, so that when the Reagan administration came in, a lot of the senators, a lot of the House members already had a bit of an education about this. Did you work with him at all? And, can you talk to, I guess, his influence on that?
I didn't actually work directly with him, but I worked with people from the CNO's office, other defense people that were.
So Chuck Miles, Charles Haskell, your brother, John, I was reading a little bit about Senator Jeremiah Denton of Alabama. All of them were naval aviators who championed bringing back the battleships. And so it wasn't battleship people, it was pilots advocating to bring back the battleships. You would think it would be a focus on aircraft carriers, but no, it was a focus on battleships.
Well, I want to tell you, don't discount the United States Marine Corps.
Absolutely.
They were very active, very energetic, and very much believing in naval gunfire support. And a 5-inch gun on a destroyer does not really rack up as highly as a 16-inch.
Few things rack up as highly as a 16-inch gun, that's for sure. After you left the Hill, you went to work at the State Department. You were the director of the Office of Strategic Nuclear Policy. Can you tell us about that role and what you did at State?
There's a longer story, but the short story is I wound up getting that job because somebody found out I wrote my dissertation on nuclear weapons and targeting doctrine. And I would have preferred to be in the Department of Defense rather than Department of State. I guess the easiest way to say it was I had the background in terms of targeting doctrine, deterrence theory, and that kind of. And our nuclear strategy had fallen on hard times, not because of the strategy, but because of the aging of our weapon systems and the onrush of the Soviet Union's nuclear capabilities. So the policy side was important, as was the strengthening and modernizing the strategic forces of the United States. So that was my job. And the March was a big time because that's when President Reagan announced his what the media called the Star Wars, which we called the Strategic Defense Initiative. And I had a lot to do with the State Department. Didn't want Reagan to be pushing that, and the Department of Defense and the Congress did. And I was sort of the agent of influence, defeating the element in the State Department that was against the Strategic Defense Initiative. And somehow shortly after that, I got invited over to the White House to be special assistant to the president. And my assignment was the defense program in general. and the strategic modernization program in particular. And that's what I did basically 1983, 1984, and 1985.
One of the things I love the most about working here at the Battleship is we either seem to find something new every day, or we learn something new every day about the great history of this ship. And one of the things that we found probably 2 years ago now, just on a random keychain in one of our maintenance offices, was a little key that no one, I guess, had ever noticed before, and it said had a little tag on it. It said nuclear PTF on it, nuclear permission to fire. And obviously, while the DoD and the Navy will either confirm or deny the existence of nuclear weapons on board the battleship here, there's nuclear PTF key, and it happens to fit in nuclear key slot in the Combat Engagement Center. And if you ask the MARDET, the Marine Detachment on board at those times, it's very hush hush. But it just goes to show that even a battleship like this, can be a part of that discussion. In 1982. The New York Times published an article. The title of it was "The Brothers Lehman Battling Nuclear Freeze." And I'll quote from it for a minute. It said, "When people mention the Lehman Brothers in this town, nobody thinks of the Wall Street investment banking firm, but they do think of the brothers, three of them, who have come to play important roles in the Reagan administration's defense and arms control policies. In a city where political capital is the medium of exchange, the Lehman Brothers were key brokers. John is Secretary of the Navy. Joseph is chief spokesperson for the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, and Chris is director of the Office of Strategic Nuclear Policy of the State Department's Bureau of Politico and Military Affairs." Obviously, a really unique situation where you get to work in senior positions, probably in some ways closely with your siblings in the same presidential administration. Just on a personal level, what was that like to sort of have that interaction? Not just on a personal level, but on a professional level with your brothers?
First of all, it was rewarding and enhancing the mission of the president. So we enjoyed being Team Lehman and the poor Irish Catholic kids from Philadelphia as opposed to the rich people from New York with the same last name. It's amazing. I have a German last name, and I always thought I was kind of a Heinz 57 mix of different European extractions. And couple of years ago, my kids gave me a 23andMe or whichever one of those kits.
Yeah.
Very flattered when it came back because I thought I was kind of a mix of this and a mix of that and some German and Irish and Scottish. And turns out 72% Irish. So
Okay.
I have a German last name, but I still celebrate March 17th, which is coming up.
So
it was exhilarating and fun. And, I could support my brother on things, nuclear and otherwise, general advocacy for Ronald Reagan's peace through strength strategy that he was implementing. But in the nuclear realm, it was really interesting because the nuclear freeze was a powerful political movement, and the administration had to work hard to not be undermined or even defeated in terms of modernizing the element of our defense posture. And I had to travel at least once a month around the country giving speeches and countering the nuclear freeze. But amusing, the Catholic bishops were a big element of that. And they wanted to meet with the senior people of the Reagan administration, and the National Security Advisor was Jesuit trained. My brother John was Jesuit trained at St. Joe's. I was Jesuit trained, and so we could, discuss the various theological and moral issues of nuclear weapons, whether they're moral or not, and whether deterrence is a proper doctrine or not, and things like that. And so the bishops who came thinking that Ronald Reagan and his team all had horns sticking out of their head and were closer to the devil than thoughtful, concerned, patriotic Americans. And what they found was we could debate Aristotle and just worth thesis and lots of things like that. So we met them on their turf, so to speak, and I'd say we ran them off the table.
That's a great story. We're recording this in early March, and I think back to, you mentioned St. Patrick's Day coming up, and I like to joke that we have a liquor license here at the Battleship, and as I joked with our governor, who's a Murphy, through and through, that we are actually technically the biggest bar in the state of New Jersey. So we take some pride in that as well. You just stated that after your stint at state, you moved over to the White House, a special assistant to the president for national security affairs. Senior Director of Legislative and Legal Affairs on the National Security Council. Can you walk us just through a little bit about your sort of day-to-day role at the White House?
Sure. One of the interesting things is the National Security Council in general, since then and before then, is divided into regional categories or functional categories. So we had a European bureau, we had a Africa bureau, unit, a Latin America, South America category. And then we had a defense group, and legislative and legal affairs and intelligence were the functional ones. But for me, because it was legislative and legal affairs, War Powers Act and all kinds of things like that were in my ken or my jurisdiction or responsibility. So every morning there were 8 special assistants, and I was by far the youngest. Most of them were 20 years my senior. And so the first week I had to be in the staff meeting every morning at 7:30, and I lived, 40-minute drive if you're lucky. So I was up at 5:30 in the morning and on the road by 6. Because
Nice Beltway commute, I'm sure.
I was inside the Beltway originally.
Okay.
But, what happened is you in order to be prepared for the meeting, you had to know what happened overnight. So you had to go to the Situation Room and read the cables because there was no internet at that time. And so you had to get as smart as you could and grab a copy of the New York Times or the Washington Post or both. And you all had to have all that consumed and digested by 7:30 in the morning.
Long days, I'm sure.
And so, I get up at 5:30. My kids that I didn't see last night because I didn't get home till late, they're still in bed, and I'm gone already before they wake up. So they were long days and very straining in that sense. But the world was a dangerous and changing place. In particular, people allege that 1983 was almost like the Cuban Missile Crisis in terms of the danger warnings and indicators that maybe war was coming. So it was an important time, and I'll never forget this. I'd only been there like a week, and each of us would talk about our jurisdiction, for one of a better term, and what were the issues, and make the National Security Advisor. Because after our meeting, he would go brief the president every day. I think it was a nuclear weapons kind of an issue. I can't remember the topic. I just remember I had just briefed. The National Security Advisor says, well, I want you to come and brief the president on that. And I've only been there 5 days. I knew where the Oval Office was, and it was.
Was that your first time walking into the Oval Office?
I was in the Situation Room at the staff meeting. And so I said, sure, when? And I'm figuring I got 2 days to do my homework and, really be at the top of the game. He said, well, as soon as this meeting's over, kind of gulped and said, well, better than having 2 days to worry about it. I can't worry about it because I got to walk upstairs and go in the Oval Office. And that was, I will tell you, another meaningful part of that. We go in and it's just the National Security Advisor and me and the president and nobody else. And a lot of times there would be, like if it was Central America, there might be 3 of us staff, me on the Congress and money and over covert war kind of issues. But this was just the 3 of us. And president's sitting at that side of the desk and National Security Advisor's here and I'm here. And I didn't have time to sweat. Just had to go with what I got. And it was very wonderful and meaningful. But the whole time there was a little sign facing me on the outer edge of the Resolute desk. And this isn't an exact quote, but you can buy a replica of this at the Reagan Library, a gift shop if you want. But it's a man can get a whole lot done when he doesn't care who gets the credit. And I watched President Reagan do that time after time after time, share credit or defer credit and let other people claim it if they wanted to, or cause them to have their head swell because you give them the credit. And President Reagan was a great leader in that sense, in particular, very humble and very willing to share and be the responsibility and be the benefit or the heat.
It's a great motto. I love that.
Operating engineers are the men and women that move mountains. And the Engineers Labor Employer Cooperative, ELEC, puts them to work. They create opportunities for the men, women, and union signatory contractors of Local 825. Repaving our roads, keeping our homes bright and warm, and even building our favorite team stadium. We understand infrastructure. That's why ELEC and Local 825 are ready to get to work.
The battleship was then reactivated. We talked a little bit about that as part of the vision for the 600 ship Navy. And then for the fourth time she was reactivated, recommissioned. President Reagan came and spoke and oversaw that commissioning of the battleship. The first time a sitting president has ever recommissioned a United States Navy battleship. We still talk about it here quite a bit. Were you at the commissioning of the battleship?
There's an interesting story on that. The answer is no. The facts are I was invited. I had room on the airplane reserved for me, and my brother was going as the SecNav. And of course, my father served in the shadow of the New Jersey at Okinawa and probably some other places where they were in proximity in the last year of the war. So I deferred, and my dad went in my place.
That's all. Being a good son, certainly.
No, he earned it.
Yeah, absolutely. The battleship then went to Lebanon during the Civil War there. She served on station for 191 straight days. The first time a reserve relief crew was ever brought to an hourglass battleship. She was there before the Marine barracks. Actually, one of our chiefs, an ETC gentleman named Michael Drzezinski, went over to the Marine barracks and was helping the Marines with their equipment. Missed the last hop back to the ship. Said, "Okay, I'll stay over." The next morning, the barracks were bombed, and we lost the chief there. But that led to the last time this battleship ever fired its 16-inch guns in combat. And you were at the White House during that time. And you just shared with me before we were recording this about some of your experiences. Would love for you to tell it firsthand.
Very dangerous and interesting. Issue of Grenada was bubbling behind the scenes. And so after the Marine barracks, the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs and Secretary of State were all jumping in their limousine and coming over to the White House for meetings. And some of those meetings were on Lebanon. And some of those meetings were on Grenada. And Sam Donaldson, I forget whether he was ABC or NBC or CBS, I can't remember which, but a very effective but a nuisance kind of a reporter. And every time I had to walk between the West Wing of the White House and my office in the old executive office building, he'd assault me, what's going on? What's going on? I need to know. The American public have a right to know. And of course, I'm in the meetings and I'm not about to say anything. So this one particular time we were reviewing what to do in terms of Grenada, and he was just literally like reporters do, chasing you as you're walking down the way, and told me he was a representative of the American public and they have a right to know. And I said, Sam, the only person you represent is yourself and ABC News or whichever of the networks it was. And I don't have to answer to you, and I don't know you. Have a nice day. But we were doing Grenada at the time. There's a much longer story, but the Grenada decision was one of the key moments of Ronald Reagan's leadership because the State Department was vigorously opposed to using force in Grenada. And believe it or not, so was the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of Joint Chiefs. Ronald Reagan said, there are Americans there. They're in danger. We're going. And that's how the Grenada operation happened. So it's inspiring to see that kind of leadership up close. There weren't a whole lot of people in the room.
Oh, I'm sure.
Probably about 9 or 10 at the most.
And you were in the Situation Room with President Reagan, and you heard or saw the orders being given to the Battleship New Jersey to fire 16-inch guns into Lebanon?
Well, a little rusty in my memory, but I knew the president had made the decision to fire on the street, which I think is the mountain range overlooking the Beirut airport. But there was an F-14 up in the sky with a camera on its nose that happened to record the precision and devastating effect of a 16-inch gun. It was a meaningful moment. It's funny you say awesome, because if you think about a 3,000-pound round of explosive ordnance arriving at a bad guy's neighborhood, it is awesome.
Yes.
Awe-inspiring and fearsome as well.
Yes. I think I mentioned this in a previous episode, but when the battleship first arrived off the coast of Lebanon, there was an immediate short-term ceasefire. Just the presence of the battleship off the coast of Beirut was enough. I think P.X. Kelly was the commandant of the Marine Corps at the time, so just the symbol of the battleship being there was enough to have that ceasefire to hopefully scare some people into doing what the United States had wanted them to do. So, we here at the Battleship, obviously, unfortunately, we don't have too many World War II veterans left, even Korean veterans left, but we have a whole lot of guys who served on this ship in the 1980s and when the ship was in combat in Beirut, who remember that time incredibly fondly. So it's great to hear that story from another perspective, not from somebody who was here on the ship who was living it, but from someone who was, watching it from a different angle, and someone who was a part of the, decision-making process that the president used in order to, figure out what exactly the role of the battleship in our military would be in that conflict. So I certainly appreciate you telling us that. The battleship, I wanted to turn a little bit, and sort of look to the future for a moment and say the battleship was visited a few months back by a flag aide to a 4-star admiral. And he told us that they were talking about us at the Pentagon because we had just dry docked a 1940 Iowa class battleship for less than $10 million in less than 80 days. And the Navy really couldn't figure it out. And while that made us feel incredibly good about the enormous project that we undertook last year, I think it speaks to the need for real investments in our naval and maritime infrastructure. And we interviewed our congressman a few episodes back, Donald Norcross, who's a senior member of the House Armed Services Committee and the Sea Power Subcommittee. And there's an effort out there, bipartisan effort, to jumpstart shipbuilding industry again in this country. And in fact, just last night, President Trump, in his address to the joint session of Congress,
I heard it.
Also mentioned the exact same thing. We're sitting here now in the city of Camden, the former home of New York Shipbuilding, built 542 ships in this city over 68 years of doing business. It seems like the focus, the will is finally there on a bipartisan, nonpartisan basis here to really bring back our shipbuilding industry, our maritime industries. You've written about this extensively over the last couple of years about the need to revitalize our Navy. Do you think there's finally a momentum now that we could take that action and really follow through with all of this talk and rhetoric that's been talked about from both sides of the aisle for the last couple months and years?
I did listen to the President's State of the Union last night. People will scorn and scoff at this statement in some ways, but it reminded me quite a bit of Ronald Reagan because he basically looked at the Congress and said, you guys got to step up. Sadly, I noticed, and I've been to State of the Union in person way back when, and I watch it every time. I don't know it's that important for our nation and its future. I was sadly disappointed to see that the Democrats wouldn't even applaud on a return of a hostage or something like that. And I started out working on the Democratic side of Armed Services Committee. So I'm not a rabid Republican. I am a rabid navalist and a rabid national security person who believes that peace through strength is the way you keep peace. And George Washington was right. He said the best means of preserving the peace is to prepare for war, but it's expensive. But believe it or not, most people I know probably spend 2 or 3% of their income on life insurance. And defense is our life insurance. And we spend less than 4% of our gross national product on defense. And oh, by the way, the hugest portion of defense is paycheck and benefits and retirement. So it seems like a big number, and it is a big number, but it's a big nation and a big world and 7 oceans, and we depend on the seas for our livelihood and our economic comfort zone. And the Navy's what protects it and keeps the seas open. And I'm concerned that I'll get fairly controversial on this. I know I saw President Trump cashier some of the senior leadership of the military. And in the op-ed that you talked about from last August, I quote where the defeatist attitude of there's not enough money in the budget, so we just can't do it. If you're a 4-star admiral or general, you need to put your stars on the table and say, Congress, we got to spend more or we're going to go to war, and it won't be our choosing. It'll be somebody else declaring war on us. And they don't do that. And I can understand, well, you got to, live to fight another day and be an advocate for more defense. But Winston Churchill described the 90s in Europe where the politicians dared not undeceive the public. And the double negative equals a positive. It means they deceive them by not telling them the truth. And President Trump, in his first administration and now, is saying, China's coming. And I personally believe China is at war with the United States today. And it's overt, it's covert, it's subliminal, it's economic, but they want to put us in the ash can of history, not them. And we better wake up or it's going to be bad. And the Chinese philosopher Sun Tzu, if I could quickly paraphrase and
The Art of War.
bastardize The Art of War, he basically said the acme of generalship. And those of us who grew up in Philadelphia think of Acme as a food market or the Roadrunner, but Acme means sort of the pinnacle, the best, the finest. The acme of generalship is winning the war without having to fight. And if you look at what China's doing now, they're a land-based nation that had nothing of a navy until about 30 years ago when they decided they were going to make us look bad and kick our ass. And I hate to be blunt, but you asked, am I optimistic? Optimistic because I'm an optimistic person and I'm hopeful. But you mentioned, the New York ship did 500 ships. There was a polo field south of Boston on December 7th that in the next 3.5 years built 274 ships. And here it takes us 12 years of debate and another 12 years to build a ship.
Yeah.
Well, China's kicking our ass and we're hiding from the facts, and we're daring to not undeceive the public. And so the answer is we're at war with China. We just don't know it. Or I should say China's at war with us, and we ought to wake up. And we can afford it.
So I'll say we'll leave that with maybe some cautious optimism.
I'm optimistic in the long run.
We mentioned earlier you're the chairman of the board of the Landing Craft Support Museum Foundation. Can you tell us a little bit about that and the special ship that you've got out in California?
Sure. The naval gunfire support was always vitally important. It was vitally important at Normandy, and it was critically important on the island campaigns as we marched our way across the Pacific with Japan as the objective. And amphibious warfare was kind of the backwater of the Navy, because battleships and cruisers and destroyers, were the real Navy. And of course, the trouble is amphibs are the ones that bring your ammo and your food. And oh, by the way, have gunfire support to protect your troops on the way into the beach, et cetera, et cetera. So, but at Tarawa, when the naval gunfire had to stop because the little Higgins boats were moving troops to the shore, as the naval gunfire had to cease in order to destroying and damaging your own troops as they're going ashore. The Japanese, of course, were underground and were hiding or trying to avoid getting hit by the gunfire. I came up out of their holes and were waiting for the Higgins boats and the Army and the Marines as they were coming ashore. They realized there was a critical need for closer in, shallower water naval gunfire support. And there was a ship called the Landing Craft Infantry, which was a shallow draft ship that could, I think, take 120 troops or thereabouts and drive them all the way to the beach if they had to. And they realized instead of redesigning a ship, why don't they just take the hull and machinery and get rid of the 120 troops and wipe the deck clear and put a whole boatload of guns and rockets on it. And they converted landing craft infantry to landing LCI gun and mortar, and they had like 3 different kinds, where these ships could go into 6 or 8 feet of water and get in close and protect the troops as they're going ashore. While they were modifying the LCIs, they went and completely redesigned a thing called the Landing Craft Support Large. Was designed in a hurry, and they built 130 of them in short order because they knew they would need these ships for the invasion. 130 were built, and in the last 18 months of the war, actually probably 14 months, if I looked a little more closely, 26 were sunk or damaged beyond repair, and they were absolutely vital at Okinawa and Iwo Jima and Borneo and a couple other places. And their first real prominence in battle was at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. For Okinawa, the Japanese strategy was to fight them on the beaches, but not all that hard. And naval historians and war historians know that Japanese fell back, but they didn't fight to the death on the beach. They wanted to attrit. And so the LCSs were involved in the early beach assaults. My dad's ship was Red Beach #1. But after 3 days of that and providing gunfire support as the Marines were moving inward, and where my dad's ship was the Anton airfield was, and they captured it within a day or a day and a half. So now their job was to protect against suicide boats and the kamikaze. Right. But they decided these things had a lot of anti-aircraft capability. All of a sudden, they assigned them out on the radar picket line, 300 miles or 170 miles, I forget which, around Okinawa to prevent the Japanese Air Force and the Japanese Navy Air Force, who were trying to sink the amphibs and the supply ships and defeat the invasion of Okinawa. and the Japanese were flying from Taiwan and from homeland Japan. And the LCSs wound up, along with the destroyers, really taking the fangs out of the kamikaze. And the kamikaze were trying to defeat the invasion of Okinawa. And 3 weeks from now is day one of the Battle for Okinawa 80th anniversary. And that battle lasted until the end of June. And the LCSs were significant in the first 3 days, vitally getting the troops ashore. Then they were used to protect the troops and the supply ships. But then they found the real value in the Battle of Okinawa was in defeating the kamikaze Divine Wind. And they did. I think LCSs are credited with shooting down at least 85. And there's one ship left in the world of that design. And a bunch of World War II guys, after my dad had passed away, found out there was one left and asked me to help. And one of the guys that asked was Richard M. McCool, who was a Medal of Honor recipient from LCS 122. And his ship and my dad's ship were involved in the rescue of the USS Porter crew, which was hit repeatedly by kamikaze and actually damaged more by a bomb that missed the ship but detonated underneath it.
Okay.
And broke its back, essentially. So there's a long history, but there's one left in the world, and it's a floating museum at the former Mare Island Naval Base in Vallejo, California, which is just inland from San Francisco. So if anybody listening to this wants to go see the ship, it's in dry dock right now, but it's been a floating museum since 2007. It was in the Thailand Navy after the war.
Oh, is that right?
After the war, these ships were brought home and put in mothballs, the 100 or so that were left. And then they were brought out for Korea. And then we gave a bunch to Vietnam and Greece and Turkey. We loaned them technically, and they used them as gunboats in coastal defense and things like that, counter drug ops. The Richard McCool was invited to when he found out there was one, I made a pledge to him I wouldn't rest until we brought the ship back to the U.S. And we brought it back, and he was still alive, and he was invited to the ceremony, but he was so old, he chose that he didn't have adequate health to be there, and then he died. And the Navy named the ship the LPD-29.
Yep.
And I'm hoping I don't know where it is, but maybe we can bring it here for the 250th anniversary in October.
Yep. That would be something. So, like us, you're in the museum business.
I am, and I can tell you,
like us, you've been through the dry docking experience.
Yes, and my monthly operating costs were a lot less because it's a tiny ship compared to this. I can
imagine.
And but it's I have to tell you, it is a badass looking ship. Tokyo Rose used to denounce them regularly. They got the nickname Mighty Midgets. And the reason is, and you'll be offended by this maybe, it had more firepower per ton than the Battleship New Jersey.
Per ton, okay. I can see that. Per ton, okay.
It's a tiny ship, but it had some serious
firepower.
Gunfire support capability. It had a 3-inch gun on the bow. It had barrage rockets, had 2 Bofors twin 40 millimeters, radar directed, and 4 20 millimeter anti-aircraft. And they made that midnight requisition lots of 50 calibers that weren't authorized, but seemed like it made sense. So they'd weld them onto the railing.
We actually just got from the Navy 8 50 cals that we've now put up around the ship. So I think we're the first of the 4 Iowas who are museums that has their full complement of 50 cals.
Where were they? Midships or aft or all over?
There are 8 guns and they're all over the main deck. Yeah. Both sides.
Oh, when you got that kamikaze coming at you.
Exactly.
And in fact, there's a quote from my dad that I found one of his letters. I can't do the quote just because I have a crappy memory, but kind of like when you got a Japanese kamikaze coming at you at 250 miles an hour, in a deep dive, and you're putting up all kinds of lead, and it's hitting the airplane, but it's still coming. Time to be scared.
We also have on the ship, on the port side aft, the last living quad 40 Bofors gun in existence from this ship that was original to World War II. So that's also just a special thing for us. So Chris Lehman, thank you so much for this great conversation. We thank you certainly, and you and your family for your many years of great service to our country, our Navy. And of course, putting on my battleship hat, your efforts in helping to reactivate and recommission the Battleship New Jersey for the fourth and final time so she could yet again prove herself in combat. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. I want to tell you that I'm hoping maybe that my little ship will come and visit your big ship, like a big dog and a little dog, for the October celebration of 250.
Oh, I hope that we can make that a reality.
Be fun.
Chris, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Operating engineers are the men and women that move mountains. And the Engineers Labor Employer Cooperative, ELEC, puts them to work. They create opportunities for the men, women, and union signatory contractors of Local 825. Repaving our roads, keeping our homes bright and warm, and even building our favorite team stadium. We understand infrastructure. That's why ELEC and Local 825 are ready to get to work.